Good morning and welcome to our webinar on Teachers Pension Scheme Scotland and independent schools. What lessons can be learned from experience in England and Wales? I'm the presenter this morning, David Davison. I'm one of the owners of Spence Partners. We're a firm of actuaries and pension consultants. I had a specific sort of practice within the business that advises charities and third sector organisations, and I've been doing that for about 16 years now, so advising many hundreds of organisations in defined benefit pension schemes in particular. So I have a lot of experience with public sector schemes, multi-employer arrangements and so on, such as sort of teachers pension scheme. Also I've had involvement with Institute of Chartered Accountants in Scotland, Charity Finance Group and Pension and Long-Term Savings Association on multi-employer pension scheme issues, and also have quite a bit of experience with exercises similar to sort of teachers pension scheme and specific school exercises in England already. So what I'm going to cover this morning in the session is a bit of background, then having a look at the drivers for change in England and Wales, and what I've learned so far from that. Experience from the sort of schools consultation and staff consultation, and then looking at sort of lessons learned, and the lessons learned if Scottish schools want to sort of consider that sort of review exercise as well. I'll then have a look at the sort of next steps, implementation, likely timing and costs and so on. And you'll notice as part of the session this morning at the top right of your screen, there's a little sort of question mark box. If you press that, that will allow you to ask questions, and I'll pick up any specific questions at the end of the session. Okay, so getting set off then, in terms of obviously the sort of teachers pension scheme in England and Wales and sort of organisations exiting, there's been a lot of sort of varying numbers around the sort of the numbers participating in the scheme and so on. So the Department for Education in March 2019 suggested there were 2,319 independent schools in England, with about just short of 1,400 of those participating in teachers pension scheme. Some other research suggests there's about 1,100 schools participating in the scheme. 80 have left since October 2018, with a further 144 intimated they were leaving. Funny enough, actually, there was information actually come in at the end of last week from a Freedom of Information request that actually suggested that the Department for Education had 144 requests now to exit. So obviously that figure's a bit higher. Anyone working in the sector obviously will not have sort of been able to miss the sort of various sort of communication and various sort of press comment around this as an issue. So obviously it's quite high profile, and obviously any organisations looking at sort of reviewing this, obviously wanting to make sure you go through a process that actually keeps as many people on board as possible, and avoids as many of the issues as possible, which I'll hopefully look at this morning. And obviously the key one being the comment there on the right there about, you know, a strike threat at 100 schools. So and I know the sort of trade unions have been very sort of active, obviously, about protecting teachers, their members' interest as part of any of these sort of potential changes. So I think there are processes and sort of plans that can be put in place to actually sort of best manage that. So obviously, why have independent schools actually been looking at this? So, well, in terms of teachers pension scheme, obviously it's an unfunded pension scheme, which means the contributions that are effectively paid in by current teachers and schools at the moment pay existing retired teachers' pensions. So there's no investment of the monies, and the money isn't a sort of a segregated pool or whatever. So the money effectively goes straight into the exchequer and straight out again in pensions. So obviously, sort of demographic changes and so on have a direct impact, because the exchequer can see the sort of impact in terms of if the contributions aren't actually covering the benefits. The benefits in the scheme in England and Wales were provided on a final salary basis until 1st of April 2015, and then moved to a career average revalued earnings basis, which I'll look at in a second. The scheme provides not just the pension, but also employees can also take tax-free cash from the scheme, and they can do that via commutation. So in other words, they give up part of their pension in order to get the cash. So they give up £1 of pension for each £12 in cash. Now, I'll cover that in a bit of detail later, because that's actually quite expensive, because you're looking at effectively a conversion rate of over 8% there. So whereas probably in the market at the moment, sort of annuity rates are probably about 2.5–3%. So it's actually quite an expensive sort of conversion rate. Employee contributions range between 7.4% and 11.7%, depending on the salary the teacher is earning. And retirement ages vary depending on when you joined in the benefit category. So between age 60 and state pension age. The scheme also provides death and service benefit, so a 3x salary lump sum benefit on death before retirement, a spouse's pension on death pre and post retirement, also a retirement death grant on death post retirement. There are also ill health retirement benefits payable in there as well, so where teachers can get access to the pension benefits early in the event of ill health. And of course, all of these benefits are actually included in the overall contribution that's actually being paid for the benefits. Clearly, one of the big advantages of the sort of multi-employer aspect of the sort of teachers' pension scheme is the continuity, in that it deals very well with changes of employment. So teachers can move from one school to another, and effectively their pension actually follows them. So it's a very, very efficient way of actually sort of managing the sort of pension entitlement from that perspective. So needless to say, with those benefits, it's considered a very valuable part of a teacher's overall benefit package. Some of the sort of drivers then in terms of sort of the reason schools were actually considering this as an issue was that from September 2019, employer contributions actually increased from 16.48% to 23.68%. And bearing in mind that the contributions back prior to 2016 were only 14.1%, that's an absolutely huge increase. So it's a 43% increase on the sort of 16%, and well over a 50% increase on the 2016 figures. So you know that's a very material change, and obviously that additional cost of about £72,000 per £1 million of salary roll, coming out of independent schools' sort of constrained budgets. Such a huge increase has had a material impact. So those changes were actually based on the GAD, the Government Actuaries Department, who do evaluation of the public sector unfunded schemes every 4 years. So the valuation was actually carried out in 2016. With those contributions coming through in 2019. It takes a couple of years for the results actually to come through, and then another year before the contribution changes are implemented. So we're due another valuation from GAD on the teacher scheme from the 31st of March 2020, and given market conditions at that point, that could be sort of a bit problematic. So it's unlikely we're going to see impacts of that probably until 2022, with sort of contributions probably at some point, and any further changes to contributions at some point in 2023. Clearly, as a defined benefit scheme, from an employer perspective, in other words for the schools, there's absolutely no certainty in terms of the cost. That cost can actually just change in the future based on changes in market conditions. So there's the potential for further cost increases in the future. Also, all the public sector schemes are currently having to deal with the McLeod judgment, which is where effectively all the public sector schemes had a protection for members for 10 years from the date of the change in regulations in 2015, which protected staff who were close to retirement, within 10 years of retirement. That change has actually been seen to be unlawful, and therefore there's going to have to be a sort of a compensation payment to actually make sure everyone's put in an equivalent position, and that'll add to the cost of running any of these schemes. And I'll cover the potential costs in Scotland of that later on in the session. One of the crucial elements really in terms of changing around the scheme as well is that as an unfunded scheme, the teachers' pension scheme, there is no cessation cost to exit the scheme. Currently, if you're in a funded scheme, such as a local government scheme, if you try and exit the scheme, then there's a very significant one-off cost at the point of exit, and that doesn't actually apply on the teachers' pension scheme. So if we move on to the sort of engagement, I think your starting point, if you're looking at any review exercise with this, is around the sort of consultation requirements and what's actually provided to date. So I think the first thing you have to understand is what do your contracts of employment actually say, what have job adverts, for example, actually said sort of historically, and understanding if that actually specifically mentions participation in the teachers' pension scheme for teachers, in which case if you are making a change in the future, that's obviously going to be a change of contract. Consultation requirements, the pension regulator sets out consultation requirements for any changes to pension benefits, and if you've 50 or more employees, then there's a statutory consultation of a minimum of 60 days required. If you've less than 50 employees, then there's a voluntary consultation process. However, I would expect, given the magnitude of any likely changes that you might be making to a teacher's pension benefits, that a sort of a mandatory 60-day consultation as a minimum is going to be required. Ultimately, as part of the consultation, the objective of the consultation is to have all staff agree to the change of contractual terms. And unfortunately, in exercises that I've been involved with, we've managed to actually sort of do that. The last resort as part of this is obviously going through a dismissal and re-engagement process where staff are actually dismissed from current contract and re-employed on a new contract without the teachers' pension scheme being provided. As I say, that's very much a last resort in the process, and there's other sort of steps can be taken before you get to that. In terms of consultation, you need to take into account that if you're going through this sort of consultation, that if you do end up going to a dismissal and re-engagement process or have to extend the consultation process, then that needs to be factored into the timing. And obviously any dismissal with the teacher needs to have at least one term notice. So therefore you need to factor that into your consultation timing process actually as well. In terms of engagement with school boards to date, one of the sort of starting points is sort of consider how much financial modelling has already been carried out by the schools. In my experience, usually a lot, because usually the review of the pension benefit is very much considered as a last resort. Schools don't want to change it unless they're actually forced to do so. So usually there will be a lot of financial modelling actually already carried out about sort of alternatives. I think it's then important to identify what was the scope of that modelling, what other alternatives to pension have been considered in detail, how have those actually been costed. I think it's also worth considering the sort of experience of school boards in terms of doing this, because in my experience they'll be very much front and centre of the communication, because you have to sort of manage conflicts here, and it's likely that obviously senior staff may well be already in the scheme, so therefore you have to manage those conflicts and make sure those are sort of effectively implemented. So I think having sort of identifying the experience on the board and who can actually take responsibility in terms of actually communicating this is very important, and sort of identifying the various sort of skill sets. Clearly what you'll need to also then be in a position to do is have access to sort of very detailed member information. in terms of being able to analyse what the potential impact and so on actually is, and consider what any replacement sort of scheme might look like. So you're considering then what sort of design that new scheme might actually look like, and also the potential for any additional benefits such as death and service costs or critical illness costs that I mentioned earlier. As a starting point, I think with this, one of the first bits of experience was, I think you really want the employee cost to be below the existing teachers' pension scheme level, because I think if you're setting a contribution level that's above the teacher scheme for what primarily would be a less valuable benefit, then I think that makes the actual communication message sort of more difficult. Certainly providing sort of flexibility to increase the level of contribution for employees is fine, but I think the minimum contribution should probably be at or below what the existing contribution level actually is. I think schools also want to sort of understand their makeup of their staff profile and service and sort of as well, because I think you want to sort of try and get an idea of how this is going to impact, and the impact could be very different depending on the shape of the staff. So it'll impact differently for older people than it will for younger people, and all of these issues require time, and really the sort of first lesson I would sort of say I've sort of learned is you permanently underestimate the amount of time that's actually likely to be required. So starting early on this is very valuable. As an indication, one of the things we've sort of looked at with schemes of this type is identifying what the actual impact for staff might be of a change in different levels of proposals and so on, and different levels of contributions. So for example, looking at this, we looked at different service periods for staff, and we looked at then different contribution levels going into a replacement scheme. And you can see from the scatter diagram that it has different impacts. So for example, people who are much younger, towards the sort of left-hand side, it doesn't really have that much of an impact, because you haven't built up sort of benefits in teachers' pension scheme to date, and you've got a very long term to actually go before it actually sort of impacts on your benefits. So potentially good long-term levels of return. Also, if you're very close to retirement, it has a fairly minimal impact, but it does have quite a material impact, usually for sort of staff who are in that sort of middle category, the sort of 30 to sort of 50 category, where it actually does make an impact on the projected benefits. So that can be something that's useful to actually sort of identify in terms of what sort of impact it might have for your specific school population. Ultimately then, in terms of sort of lessons learned, I think that the consultation timing needs to be driven by the objectives, the dismissal and re-engagement process, and pretty much the amount of preparation completed. In terms of objectives, it could be things like you could have financial issues which are actually driving the need for the change, and that might actually have an impact. So it really is a question at the starting point to understand that and make sure you've got sort of a clear plan for what that might look like, all the steps and the potential timing. So work out a realistic project plan to allow for all of these factors. The other thing I think that's critical, if I'm around it, is I think engagement with staff pre the consultation process to consider a range of options is also really valuable. If you can manage to engender a sort of a team approach, avoid sort of them and us type scenario, that's hugely valuable. Getting representatives, the teachers in the room, and actually discussing what other options might be available and what could be considered, so that everybody's actually considered that jointly is really valuable. Also look at how far the school wants to go or can afford to go in terms of sort of replicating the existing benefits. So do you want to look at sort of pension, life cover, critical illness, other sort of types of benefits, and how much those are likely to cost? So again, getting an idea at an early stage about the costs of those is valuable, so that you can actually put that out with the consultation proposal. And obviously also sort of clear budget setting, what is the impact of this actually going to be, and what's going to be the cost of the process as you go through. But I think sort of transparency around this is sort of really key, giving people as much open and honest information around the process as possible. In terms of member engagement, that pretty much starts with the consultation document, and that document really has to contain information such as the sort of background to what's actually happening, looking at the proposal, what it is and why it's actually being proposed, considering the difference between defined benefit schemes and defined contribution schemes. That is something, it's likely that most organisations doing this will want to move to a defined contribution scheme, and there's very significant differences between the two types of pension planning. I'll look at what alternatives have been considered and how much depth and what the financial outputs of those actually is also valuable. How will the change affect you? And that's really looking at sort of trying to get details of how it actually gets to each employee individually, because as I say, the impact can be very different. Understanding how the consultation process works and the timing and how you provide feedback, and also where support is available, both in terms of any support that's provided by the school or generic support that might be available just within the marketplace. And obviously then considering which areas are likely to need legal advice as well. So that consultation document very much sets the scene, although the important thing as well about that is, there will be a lot of information in that, and it's unlikely that everyone will get it at first pass, particularly in my experience. There'd be a bit of an emotional reaction to it, so actually understanding all the information sort of first pass is going to be quite difficult. So I think there's sort of other steps obviously there as well. So I think the other things is you need to consider if there's any requirement for engagement with trade unions, and the trade unions will expect meaningful consultation. Certainly sections I was involved with, there was sort of trade union representatives at pretty much all of those, and there were sort of discussions with the sort of staff and so on immediately after any of the sessions. I think it's worth then, at the point of very close to the point of issuing the consultation document, having an initial briefing that sets out the process and answers initial questions and refers to sort of clarifying points actually in the consultation document. I think then probably a few weeks further on, you probably, whenever that information is sort of sunk in, you want to provide the detailed member presentations, probably not leaving too much time between those. Because I think if there's misunderstandings, then they can tend to grow as people sort of talk to each other and don't actually necessarily completely understand the impact. I think it's then after those member presentations, considering whether you want to provide staff with member one-to-ones that look at their specific position, or engage a financial advisor to look at their position and maintain issues around sort of conflicts there. And one of the things we tend to do with these as well is provide member comparative illustrations, so that they're much more detailed, looking at staff's individual position. So looking at what is the cost impact in terms of the change, and also how do their benefits actually change, and providing a fair comparison between the two, so that people can do sort of realistic planning for the future after any change. And I think that the member illustration, the bespoke member illustration, is really valuable. Is usually there's a much greater perceived impact among staff over what the impact is going to be than the actual impact. So I think actually that provides some security effectively, or some comfort. Again, sort of mentioning this, transparency. I think complete transparency is key, giving as much information as possible in an open and honest way. Some lack of understanding of the existing scheme and how it works as part of sort of presentations, and really sort of clarifying exactly how that works and the sort of likely impact for people. So that was sort of valuable, and I think the illustration supports that, because you can actually show actual figures. Staff want an indication of how any change will specifically affect them. So I think doing generic or sample illustrations in a uniform format just doesn't work, because there's so many differences, as I said, between the impact on younger and older people. So I think bespoke illustrations provide a base level of understanding and comparison. And to give an example of that, the sort of illustration we sort of provide is looking at, so if you look at someone on their projected salary, so taking their current salary and service, work out how much benefits have been built up under each category, looking at what the likely total pension is at retirement, which allows for sort of pension planning, and then working out the percentage of that pension that they're going to get based on their salary. That then allows them to compare that percentage with what their current salary is, so that they can say, okay, well, if I'm on £30,000 of a salary and I'm getting an 80% proportion of that, then I'm getting £25,000 of pension a year. Is that enough for me to actually retire on, or do I need to save for more? The impact then of different contribution rates post the change, and what percentage of the sort of pension that might be based on the revised benefits. Also doing projections on that around what the likely value of the defined contribution pot is going to be. So rather than just focusing on the pension, that allows you to look at other options in terms of how the benefits might actually be paid, and also how they might be integrated with the benefits that have built up already. Also, I mentioned about tax-free cash. One of the things is looking at the sort of tax-free cash benefit and how that impacts. So one of the things, if you've got two schemes together, like a defined benefit, defined contribution, it might be you want to take more of the cash from the defined contribution, so that the value of the benefit in the defined benefit is actually much higher. And this actually will then look at that, and you can see that when you take the cash into consideration, the value of the projected final salary is actually much lower in the teacher scheme. So that highlights the cost of actually buying or actually taking the cash. So again, that can be done based on any of the contribution variables that the organisation is looking at. Then looking at the sort of maximum cash position and what additional cash might be available if people want to sort of look at sort of managing their own assets in retirement. And then looking at the sort of contribution impact. So how will the proposed change in contributions affect employees' monthly net salary? So that gives people a complete picture. In terms of sort of lessons learned, I think from the sort of staff consultation, I think at the presentations, both the initial and the sort of staff presentation, there was sort of quite a few other employee suggestions about how the schools could actually reduce cost. And most of them were sort of relatively impractical or had been considered already and sort of dismissed as not producing the sort of cost savings that were necessary. These could include things like, utilising reserves, increasing fees, and obviously you need to identify how practical that is. Reductions in admin costs, and again, usually this comes towards the end of that sort of process where there isn't really any more savings to be made, or there's very marginal savings. Reduce support staff numbers. So is there a chance to reduce the sort of the proportion of support staff to teaching staff? And again, usually in my experience, that had already been considered. And one of the other things is sort of the ability to sort of rationalise available lessons and so on, to sort of ensure you maximise sort of staff numbers. But again, they're all reasonable to be considered, but they ideally really should be considered in advance of the process. Working group who consider the issues options in advance would be beneficial. So as I said, if you could manage to get a working group, including the teachers, to actually be looking at those sorts of issues in advance, that's helpful. Creates a sort of a collaborative team approach. It's also fundamental in terms of any misunderstandings about how the teacher scheme might work. We'll need to deal with different individual objectives, because as I say, there's different objectives for teachers in terms of sort of early retirement, late retirement, depending on what ages they are, and so on. And obviously getting detailed financial analysis and comparison between the different options is valuable, sort of considering people's age, salary, past service, normal or early retirement, and the tax-free cash. I think also in terms of sort of managing the Chinese whispers pre the process and post the process, whenever you're actually in the consultation process, it's difficult, because people get the information and then they interpret it in a certain way. Even if that interpretation actually turns out not to be right, then that can get shared amongst other individuals. So getting the factual information out there as early as possible is valuable. Also, I think boards need to understand, if sort of teachers are actually sort of saying, well, yeah, well, if you do this, we'll just resign and we'll go somewhere else. I think boards need to understand the realistic impact of that on the school. Is that likely? And if it is likely, how many people might go, and what would be the impact on the quality? And obviously understanding what other local independent schools and sort of state schools are actually doing, to make sure they understand how likely that actually is, and also understanding, being able to promote the positives of working for the existing school. So in terms of future scheme options, if you're sort of looking to sort of review that, I think the sort of starting point might be what's been called the Taunton option, after a school in Taunton and Somerset, which looked at a reduced employer cost, a teacher's pension scheme. Now, the way they did that was to increase the teachers' contributions effectively via salary sacrifice arrangement, so that they could maintain the teacher's pension scheme. So to give you an idea, the way that might have been done would be, so you take a gross salary of £30,000. The previous employee contribution was 8.6%. The employer pension contribution was 16.48%. It shows the income tax, employee national insurance, and employer national insurance. So the take-home pay from that was just short of £22,000, and the total pension payment going in was just over £7,000. So the total employer cost was just short of £38,000. If the employee actually reduced the gross salary by £1,900, then the employer contribution needs to go up effectively, so that's compensating for that increased employer contribution. So because the salary is lower, the income tax and national insurance for both employer and employee are lower. So therefore, the net cost, the net take-home pay for the individual has fallen to just short of sort of £20,700, and the total cost for the employer is exactly the same. So that way, you've effectively got the contribution paid within the same employer budget. So the increased contributions obviously payable by teachers via salary sacrifice will allow them to maintain the teacher's pension scheme. Using the 30,000 salary, there was a 7.2% increase in the pension contributions. So the salary reduction estimate there was around £1,900, which produced a sort of take-home pay reduced by about sort of £1,292 a year, so about roughly about £100 a month. Ideally, if you can actually do the change around salary review time, then obviously that negates the impact. And one of the things you can actually do is say, okay, well, we can either give you a salary increase, or we can allow you to keep the teacher's pension scheme by you not taking your salary increase, for example. So that impacts then on the timing of any exercise. The other thing that the schools have to consider then is, do the teachers pick up the full cost of that, or part of the cost, or are the additional costs going to be phased in over a period of time? So do you say want teachers to pick up 2% and 3% and 4% and so on over a period, so that it's or phased in over a couple of pay reviews? Obviously it's pretty complex, as it varies the salary and contribution rate, so there'll be a bit of work involved each year in terms of sort of making sure that it runs efficiently. And obviously that's an option that the teachers can take, but if they don't want to take that and pay the higher contributions, they can opt out into an alternative defined contribution scheme. The second option is then looking at a defined contribution scheme. Obviously that provides complete certainty of cost, so you set what the employer and the employee are actually going to pay. You've got flexibility around the contribution basis, so you can decide just, okay, here is the contribution basis, so we're going to pay 15% and you're going to pay 5%, or we're going to pay 12 and you're going to pay 6, or whatever it actually is. Alternatively, you could set a sort of a matched option where you'll pay the same as whatever the teachers pay, or a multiple matched option. So if the teachers pay, for each 1% the teachers pay, you will pay 2 or 3 times that. You can also then look at things like joining periods. So, do you want to have a certain amount of time before the member joins a certain category in the scheme, so that they pay lower contributions initially on joining, but then they get access to higher contributions if they've been there for a longer period of time. So that if you're doing that, then say you set a period of sort of 3 years where there's auto enrollment type contributions, then that saving you make against higher contributions allows you to pay higher contributions to those people who make it beyond the 3-year period. Again, you can have sort of tiered type contributions like that, so that those contributions are different after 3 years or 5 years or 10 years. So there's a lot of flexibility around how the basis can actually be worked. And then you want to consider those contributions versus the sort of existing contributions, because that will be a benchmark. One of the other things is the quality of the contributions that are paid into the scheme will impact on the scheme selection, because the higher the contributions and the better quality the contributions on average are, then the lower the costs are likely to be charged by the scheme. And then also considering what other benefits you're prepared to provide. So are you prepared to provide lump sum benefits? I would usually recommend that, because they're perceived as very valuable. And then actually whether there's any sort of critical illness benefits, or whether you want to provide a menu of flexible benefits as part of any sort of revision. But that can all be considered as part of the pre-consultation and consultation process. In selecting the defined contribution scheme, you want to make sure you're getting something that is competitive on pricing and charges, as I said, based on the total and average contributions paid. You want an organisation providing it who are financially very strong and likely to be about for a number of years to provide the benefits, provides good investment returns and good investment options, looking at sort of quality administration and also IT support. So what sort of website information is actually available for staff to review their options, and also if there are any other options provided, such as on retirement, is there flexibility on retirement to use drawdown or whatever as part of the scheme as well. So I think some of the key considerations on transition then I've sort of highlighted already might be around impact of tax-free cash, impact on the death and service benefits, what would be the impact on early retirement, and how you would actually integrate the 2 sets of benefits from teachers' pension scheme and the new defined contribution scheme together to get the best benefits for staff. There's already sort of some replacement schemes out there. I think Aviva launched the trust for a pension trust for independent schools, which is defined contribution master trust for teachers. TPT Retirement Solutions have the pension scheme for the education sector, which runs alongside the independent schools pension scheme, and it offers both DB and DC benefits. Although if you're moving from the teachers pension scheme, you really have to be very careful in moving to another defined benefit scheme, which might have uncertain costs and also an exit cost if at some point you actually want to come out of it. There are a number of other schemes available as well, and you would actually look at a sort of a competitive sort of tender exercise to sort of decide which would be best for you. And obviously there could be the potential, if a number of schools are doing this, to look at a specific scheme similar to the Aviva scheme, but for the Scottish sector. So I think from finishing off then on a sort of Scottish perspective, obviously in terms of the Scottish Teachers Pension Scheme, there's 2 schemes there. The Scottish Teachers Superannuation Scheme, which was the final salary scheme, which closed in April 2015, and then the Scottish Teachers Pension Scheme 2015, which is the CARE scheme, which new teachers joined from 1st of April 2015. Both of these are managed by the Scottish Public Pension Agency, SPPA. Obviously sort of very similar issues in terms of sort of funding as in England and Wales, although the contribution revision was slightly different. The employer contributions increased from 17.2% in August 2019 to 23% from 1st September 2019 through until March 2023. Obviously that means it's £58,000 per £1 million of salary roll increase, so a bit less than in England. Employee contributions range from 7.2 to 11.9, so very similar. There's some tapered protection being factored in there at the moment for what I mentioned earlier, the McLeod impact, and it's estimated that the cost of that is going to be about £500 million, which will have to be picked up as part of the next sort of valuation. Obviously, independent schools are eligible to join the scheme. It's not compulsory that they join the scheme. And as at 31st of March 2019, there were 147 employers in the scheme in total, compared to 152 back in March 2018. So in terms of conclusions then, I think the key actions really are, I think, board engagement and establishing of the sort of key messages at the start, really understanding what the options are, and if you're taking this to sort of teachers, understanding the messages that you want to provide. Obviously sort of clearly document that and sort of have an audit trail, understanding which members of the board are actually going to take on board which sort of sections. Agree the timetable and have some contingencies in there in terms of if things change. Review the contracts of employment and the legal position, and obviously then agree and design the member communication so that it has the sort of the style of the school and so on, and you're getting the sort of bespoke messages out there. You have to select the new scheme design and provider. Consider the death and service options, and also considering a sort of a salary sacrifice arrangement. So the salary sacrifice arrangement I mentioned for the teachers' pension scheme, you can use for a defined contribution scheme, which increases the value of what you're providing the staff at no additional cost. So it's worth reviewing that as well. Then you've got to deliver the consultation, illustrations, presentations one-to-one, and potentially any Q&As. What I've seen as part of this process was a live Q&A going on to try and avoid this sort of misinformation being sort of spread about. So as points are raised, there's an online live Q&A which actually is updated based on responses to any of the questions raised. Obviously then finally you have to implement any proposals notifying Teachers Pension Scheme, SPPA, members, new scheme, and implementing any sort of contractual changes. I think in terms of likely costs for sort of a process running this for about sort of probably 6 months plus, you're probably looking at actuarial, legal, project management likely to be somewhere in that region, £15,000 to £25,000, depending upon the input required and the process that's adopted. Certainly one of the other things that's worth considering is whether there's scope for cooperation between schools in terms of doing this. I've done this with a number of other schemes where a number of sort of participants have collaborated, and while it doesn't sort of reduce the, it's not going to reduce the sort of the overall cost for doing this by sort of 50% or whatever, it might have a sort of 10 or 15% impact because you can share the original drafting material and the sort of communication and timeline process. So it's certainly worth considering. I think then finally the key message are sort of time is your friend. You start the process as early as possible. I think the board need to engage and actually drive the process, and you need to sort of split out who's going to be responsible for doing what. Have a very clear audit trail, because certainly whenever the presentations were happening, the teachers were asking lots of questions and asking for sort of proof. If you said, okay, well one solution doesn't work, okay, show me the reason why it doesn't work and the actual costings. So making sure there's a clear audit trail that you can actually do that. Maximize engagement with the teachers pre any consultation. So prior to establishing a working party, exploring other options that might produce the same sort of cost savings, taking feedback and sort of avoiding sort of them and us. And ultimately then you can refine and agree any proposals which ultimately go out as part of the consultation. Okay, so that's pretty much what I wanted to cover in terms of the sort of the session, and happy to take any questions at this stage if there are any there.
There is one there, David. It's one from Francis Macaulay, who asks, have you found the trade unions to be helpful, and what has their major concern been?
Yes, in general, yes. I think providing there's an understanding and a clear understanding of why you're doing it. I think that the trade union's position is going to be that they want to protect members' benefits as much as possible. And I think that's getting them involved in the process, a bit like the early in the process, a bit like the sort of teachers. I think some of the, I would say that probably the major issues that I found were around, if you didn't start the process early enough, then it felt like it was rushed, and the trade unions reflected that actually as well. I think if the process was looked at over a reasonable time period where you can involve all the parties, then yeah, I think that the trade unions can be very helpful, in terms of, and I think certainly not just in terms of sort of teachers' pension scheme, but certainly my experience doing other reviews. I think if it's quite clearly shown that there's not other alternatives, which again goes back to this sort of proper review. If there's not other alternatives, then yes, I think that it's just getting everyone on side as part of that process.
I can't see any more questions there at the moment.
Okay. Great. Thanks for that. Hopefully, if that's been valuable and given you a bit of sort of insight. Clearly, if there's any other questions, you've got our contact details and so on there. Just drop me a note, and I'm happy to come back to you on those points if there's anything sort of more specific. But thanks for your time. Hopefully you found it informative. Thank you. Bye.